I lied. 50 years ago, as a USGS geologist, I looked the federal government in the eye and told a lie that saved this valley and Bigfoot. I became a ghost in these woods just to keep his home untouched. Then, yesterday, the devil showed up in a business suit. He smiled and showed me the development plan, where Bigfoot's sacred cliffs now stand. They're putting in infinity pools and a golf course. My life's greatest act was for nothing. They think they've won. They think they're taking this land, but they don't understand.
The scent of cedar has been the one constant. It is in the floorboards of this house my father built with his own hands, in the dust motes that dance like tiny golden spirits in the afternoon sun, and in the fine, pale shavings that curl from the block of wood in my lap. At 80 years old, my hands have a tremor that I can no longer still, a fine vibration that is the rhythm of my decline. But the muscle memory from more than 60 years of carving holds true. The knife still knows the path. I was working on a small, smooth river bird, its head cocked just so, a creature of patience and wood grain, when the sound began. It was not a sound of the forest. I know all those sounds, from the whisper of wind in the high pines to the crack of a falling branch a mile away. This was a high, electric whine, thin and persistent, like a trapped mosquito the size of a hawk. It was a sound of wire and speed, and it did not belong here. I set down my knife, and the half-formed bird, the piece of the afternoon shattered. I stepped onto the porch, my knees complaining with a series of dull, familiar clicks with every move. There, hanging above the dark green wall of the Douglas firs that guard my property line, it hung in the sky, a drone. It was a sleek, four-propellered insect of black plastic and wire, an alien geometry against the soft blue of the sky. Its single black eye, a lens on its underside, swiveled with a smooth, unnatural purpose, scanning. It hovered for a long moment directly over the dense, protected ridge to the north, a place no one has had a permit to enter for half a century, thanks to a lie I told a lifetime ago. Then, with a sickening stutter that I felt in my own chest, one of its rotors failed. The steady whine became a ragged, desperate shriek. It listed, spun in a dizzying, uncontrolled arc, and dropped from the sky like a stone. It disappeared into the canopy with a final crash of breaking branches and a thud that seemed to shake the very ground. A knot of ice formed in my stomach. I stood there on the porch for a long time, my hand gripping the weathered railing, listening to the familiar silence rush back in to fill the void. But it was different now. It was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a held breath, the silence of a world that has seen something it should not have. That night, sleep was an impossibility. The image of that black shape tumbling from the sky was burned into my mind. I took my old gnarled walking stick, lit a single lantern, and went out into the cool, dark air. The moon was nearly full, bright enough to silver the edges of the leaves and show me the path. I found the drone's wreckage near the creek bed, a place of damp earth and smooth stones. Its plastic shell was shattered, a broken carapace, leaking the faint, acrid smell of burnt electronics. It was a wound in the forest, ugly and out of place. I raised the lantern, its yellow light pushing back the shadows, and I saw what I had feared I would find. Beside the mechanical ruin, pressed deep into the soft, damp earth was a single, perfect footprint. It was over 20 inches long, the toes distinct, the impression so deep that it had displaced the small stones around its edge. It was a mark of impossible weight and deliberate presence, a sign that the drone had not fallen unseen. It began in 1972. I was not an old man then. I was a geologist with the United States Geological Survey, 30 years old, hard-headed and convinced of my own infallibility. A man who believed the world was a collection of data points waiting to be measured and understood. My job was to survey the Cascade foothills for the bedrock stability of a proposed hydroelectric dam, a monument to progress that would have drowned 100,000 acres of old-growth forest under a placid, sterile lake. For weeks, my team and I worked under the vast, indifferent sky. We set up seismographs, drilled core samples that smelled of ancient, wet stone, and documented every fault line and fissure with a clinical detachment. The work was routine, a familiar rhythm of procedure and documentation, until our equipment started failing. It was not the usual sort of failure, the kind caused by moisture or a rough drop. Our gear was not breaking, it was being altered. The first instance was a seismograph, a heavy, delicate piece of machinery weighing nearly 200 pounds, anchored to the earth with 4 deep steel pins. We arrived one morning to find it had been moved 50 yards overnight, lifted clear from its anchors without so much as bending them. It was placed gently on a bed of moss, unharmed, as if a giant had picked it up to inspect it before setting it down carefully. There were no drag marks, no footprints my colleagues could identify. A week later, an entire line of survey stakes, hammered a foot into the hard ground, were pulled up and laid in a neat, parallel row beside the path, like soldiers at rest. Our field notes, left in a locked steel box, would be opened, the heavy lid lifted without leaving a single scratch on the paint. The pages would be turned, smudged with something earthy and dark. But nothing was ever taken. Nothing was ever destroyed. My colleagues, good men who trusted in blueprints and logic, blamed local protesters, eco-saboteurs from the cities who did not understand the necessity of cheap electricity. I listened to their theories around the campfire and nodded, but I knew better. I had started to see the signs they missed, the subtle grammar of the forest that was not in any of our textbooks. I'd seen the impossibly bent saplings, young alders folded over at a perfect 90-degree angle 7 feet from the ground, marking a perimeter I was beginning to recognize. I heard the low, percussive knocks that echoed across the valley at dusk, a language I did not understand but felt in my bones. 3 slow strikes, a pause, then 3 more, a call and response that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was organized. It was intelligent. One evening in late September, I stayed behind after the crew packed up and drove their trucks down the winding logging road. I told them I wanted to recalibrate a sensor, a lie that felt small and insignificant compared to the one that was beginning to form in my mind. I hiked to the high ridge where the equipment interference had been strongest, a place where the air grew still and the forest seemed to watch. The sun was setting, bleeding orange and purple across the peaks, and the valley below was sinking into deep shadow. And that's when I saw him. He was standing in the twilight at the edge of a clearing, a silhouette of impossible size against the dying sun. simply watching our abandoned site. He was not a monster. He was not a beast of rage. He was a sentinel, still and patient, a part of the landscape itself. He was taller than any man, broader than any bear, and he stood with a quiet authority that was absolute. He turned his head, a slow, deliberate movement, and looked in my direction across the gulf of evening air. He knew I was there, and in that moment, as his unseen eyes met mine, I understood. This was not vandalism. This was a negotiation. This was a silent, desperate plea from a world that had no other way to speak. The next day, I drove back to the regional office and filed my final report. My hands were steady as I wrote the words that would end my career with the survey, though I did not know it at the time. I fabricated data about deep, unstable microfractures in the bedrock. I invented seismic risks, citing phantom tremors my instruments had never detected. I lied, professionally and meticulously, using the language of my science to betray it, committing an act of heresy to save a valley. 2 months later, the dam project was officially and permanently shelved due to unacceptable geological instability. That was the first secret, the one that taught me that some truths are not found in data, and that the most important work I would ever do would never be recorded. The drone belonged to a young man named Ben. He arrived 2 days later, on a Tuesday morning that had until then been perfectly ordinary. He drove a clean, new Subaru that seemed offensively bright against the muted greens and browns of my world. And he stepped out with the kind of restless energy that belongs to the young and the terminally online. He was earnest and tech-savvy, wearing an expensive jacket that hissed with every movement and carrying a tablet that held the last known GPS coordinates of his lost machine. He called himself a wilderness content creator, a phrase that felt so alien on my tongue, I never dared to repeat it. I played the part I had perfected over decades of dealing with lost hikers and the occasional curious tourist, the forgetful, slightly senile old man, a harmless relic of a bygone era. I offered him a mug of weak coffee, cupped my ear as if I were hard of hearing, and told him with a practiced vacancy that I had not seen or heard a thing out of the ordinary. He was persistent. For a week that felt like a year, he combed the woods, his enthusiasm a grinding noise against my frayed nerves. His presence was a constant, low-grade fever. I watched him from my window as he moved through the trees, a flash of neon blue against the ancient bark, his progress marked by the unnatural snap of branches under his expensive boots. My heart, a tired old muscle, felt like a trapped bird in my chest. I knew, with a certainty that was cold and absolute, that if he found the drone's shattered shell, he would find the footprint pressed into the earth beside it. That single, perfect impression was a confession, a piece of evidence so definitive it would undo a lifetime of careful silence. The forest, which had always been my sanctuary, became a cage where I could only watch the predator stalk closer to my secret. By the 7th day, his search pattern had brought him perilously close to the creek bed. I watched him consult his tablet, his face alight with the thrill of the hunt, and I knew I could no longer be passive. I had to intervene. That afternoon, while he was casting his grid on the eastern slope, I took a risk that made my old bones ache with more than just age. I hiked out to the western side of my property, a place of thick undergrowth and steep, rocky inclines. My breath came in ragged bursts, and my walking stick, a companion of 30 years, felt heavy in my hand. I found a stand of dead, dry timber, and with all the strength I could muster, I used the stick to strike a thick, brittle branch. The sound was a sharp crack, like a rifle shot, that echoed through the quiet air. I held my breath, listening. After a minute, I did it again, then moved 50 yards deeper and broke another, mimicking the sound of a large, heavy animal moving carelessly through the undergrowth. I was creating a ghost, a fiction of sound, to lure him away from the truth. It worked. I saw his blue jacket change direction. He spent the rest of the day and all of the next chasing my phantom noises, his shouts of excitement and frustration. A strange, new music in my woods. As I was making my way back that first evening, exhausted and trembling from the exertion and the fear, I saw something that stopped my breath and rooted me to the path. On a large, flat rock that overlooked the very trail Ben was now fruitlessly following was a display. It was a freshly placed pile of bones, a deer, stripped clean with an almost surgical precision, and beside them, a single, enormous pine cone. The kind that grows only on the oldest sugar pines at the highest elevations. It was not a kill site. It was an arrangement, a piece of theater. The bones were stacked, not scattered. The pine cone was placed like a centerpiece. It was a diversion, far more compelling and authentic than my clumsy branch breaking. It was a signpost designed to capture the attention of a man like Ben, to give his camera something to feast on. A profound and chilling understanding washed over me. He had seen me. He had watched me from the shadows, understood what I was doing, and had decided to help. He had created his own superior diversion to protect our shared secret. In that moment, standing in the fading light, I realized the weight I had carried for 50 years had shifted. It was no longer just mine. We were co-conspirators. Ben found the drone's memory card 2 days later. He must have gone back to the creek bed, sifting through the debris with the single-minded focus of a zealot. The machine itself was a worthless pile of shattered plastic and bent wire, but the small black chip, no bigger than my thumbnail, was intact. He came to my door just as the sun was setting and the long shadows of the firs were stretching across my yard. He did not knock. He hammered on the door with the flat of his hand, and when I opened it, his face was alight with a feverish, almost manic glow. He was streaked with mud, and his expensive jacket was torn at the sleeve, but his eyes were burning with discovery. He did not have a clear picture. He did not have the kind of proof that would end all arguments. What he had was far more dangerous. He shoved his tablet into my hands, his fingers trembling. On the screen was a video file, just 3 seconds of corrupted thermal footage, a silent, ghostly window into a world not meant for human eyes. It showed a massive hot shape moving behind the dense latticework of trees before the signal cut out into a blizzard of digital static. It was an indistinct, blurry orange blob against a cooler blue background. It was nothing, a smudge, a glitch. And yet, it was everything. It was a heat signature that corresponded to no known animal in these woods. A shape that moved with the bipedal grace of something that was not a bear, and a size that defied all explanation. "This is it," he whispered, his voice hoarse, pointing a muddy finger at the glowing smear on the screen. "Right here. This is going to change the world." I handed the tablet back to him, my own hands feeling cold and ancient. I tried to feign confusion, to dismiss it as a bird or a trick of the light. But my voice failed me. The lie would not form. He did not notice. He was lost in his own triumph. He told me he'd already sent the data, encrypted and uploaded via a satellite link, to a well-funded cryptozoological team. He followed online, a group with a serious or scientific-sounding name. They were organizing an expedition. He said they would be here in a month, maybe less. They would bring everything. Thermal imaging arrays that could see through the densest canopy, parabolic microphones that could hear a leaf fall a mile away, and a team of scent dogs trained to track primates. They would grid the entire ridge. They would set camera traps on every game trail. They would strip that forest bare with their technology, peeling back every layer of shadow and silence until its deepest secret was pinned and cataloged under their bright, unblinking lights. That night, after he had finally gone, a cold clarity settled over me. It was a feeling I had not had since 1972, the day I decided to falsify my geological report. It was the calm that comes when all hope is lost and only a single, terrible path remains. My decades of quiet protection, of misfiled reports and redirected surveys, of a life lived around the edges of a profound secret, were about to be undone by a blogger with a broken toy. I put on my heaviest coat, the old wool one that still smelled of wood smoke, and 50 winters. I lit my storm lantern, its yellow light a small, brave circle against the encroaching dark, and I hiked up to the northern ridge. I went to the place I'd never named aloud, the place I called, only in my own mind, the warden's home. For years, I'd made this pilgrimage to leave gifts, crisp autumn apples, slabs of smoked salmon I bought in town, once, a beautifully woven wool blanket I'd found at a trading post. These were my offerings, my silent apologies for the intrusion of my species. But tonight, I came to take something away. I came to desecrate. I found the collection of smooth river stones he had left for me over the years, gifts I had always left in place as a sign of respect. They were arranged in careful spirals near the base of a lightning-scarred cedar. With my aching, arthritic hands, I dismantled those patterns. I scattered the stones, throwing them deep into the brush, where they would be swallowed by the earth, their language of quiet communion broken forever. I moved to the entrance of what I knew to be their primary denning area, a space shielded by a screen of young saplings that had been bent and woven together with impossible strength. I put my shoulder to them and pushed. I took my walking stick and I broke them, splintering the living wood, tearing apart the doorway to their home. Finally, I took that same walking stick and I scuffed and tore at the ground, erasing the faint paths their generations had worn into the earth. Paths I could read as clearly as a map. I was destroying our shared history, erasing every sign of our silent, strange friendship. Every movement was a betrayal, a small death. I was a vandal in my own church. a traitor to the only faith I had ever truly kept. But I knew, as the cold wind bit at my face, that it was the only way. To save them from discovery, I had to destroy all evidence that they had ever known me at all. The expedition was worse than I'd imagined. They arrived not in a single, dusty truck, but in a convoy of 3 identical black vehicles that absorbed the morning light. There were 6 of them, a team that moved with the quiet, unnerving efficiency of a wolf pack. They were led by a woman with a chillingly pragmatic demeanor, a Dr. Eris Thorne, whose name Ben mentioned with a reverence that turned my stomach. She had sharp eyes that seemed to catalog everything as a potential data point, including me. They set up their base camp in the meadow just outside my property line, a place where deer usually came to graze at dawn. Within hours, it was transformed into a sterile, geometric encampment of nylon tents and humming machinery. I tried to intervene on that first day. I walked over, leaning heavily on my stick, and offered my folksy, practiced warnings about the early autumn bears being unusually aggressive, about the ground on the North Ridge being notoriously unstable after the rains. She listened without truly hearing, her gaze fixed on a topographical map displayed on a ruggedized tablet. When I finished, she gave me a thin, dismissive smile. "Thank you for the local color, Mr. Kell," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "We have geological surveys and our team is equipped for any local fauna." They were professionals. My simple, rustic truths were just local color to them, anecdotes to be filed away with folklore. For 3 days and 3 nights, I became a prisoner in my own home. I watched their lights flicker in the woods, cold, white beams that sliced through the sacred darkness. A low, constant hum from their generator replaced the sound of crickets and frogs, a mechanical heartbeat that was profoundly wrong. During the day, they sent out teams of 2, moving in careful, sweeping patterns, their radios crackling with a clipped, professional jargon. At night, they reviewed their data, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of their screens. My helplessness was a physical weight, a pressure in my chest that made it hard to breathe. The forest had ceased to be a sanctuary. It was now a specimen under a microscope, and I could do nothing but watch the lens focus. On the 4th night, I knew I could not wait any longer. They were getting closer, their search grid tightening around the warden's territory. I did the only thing I had left to do, the one thing they would never expect. I took the small river bird I had been carving, the one I was working on the day the drone appeared. Its cedar body was smooth and perfect in my palm, its head cocked in a state of permanent, innocent curiosity. It was a piece of the forest soul, and I was about to use it as a Judas goat. I waited until the moon was high and their camp had settled into a quiet watch. I did not hike towards the northern ridge. I went south towards the public hiking trails. I did not go in. I circled their camp at a wide, safe distance, leaving a trail of my own, a deliberately obvious human trail. I, who had spent a lifetime moving through these woods without leaving a trace, now made myself loud and clumsy. I snapped dry twigs under my heel. I left deep, clear boot prints in the patches of wet mud near the stream. It was a performance of incompetence, a desecration of my own skills. Finally, about 100 yards from their perimeter, I found a large, moss-covered stump, directly in the path they would take the next morning. I placed the smallest carved bird on top of it, its pale wood almost glowing in the moonlight. I wanted them to find it. I wanted them to find me. I wanted them to believe that I was the mystery. Let them think I was a lonely old fraud, a pathetic man desperate for attention, trying to create a hoax. It was the only shield I had left to offer. The next morning, I was in my workshop when they came. I was sitting in my old chair, surrounded by the silent wooden congregation of animals I'd carved over 60 years. I had a half-finished fox in my lap, and I made my hands shake as I worked the knife. They found the bird, just as I knew they would. They followed my clumsy trail with an almost contemptuous ease, their tracking skills making short work of my manufactured path. It led them right to my door. Ben was with them, his face a mask of confusion and keen disappointment. Dr. Thorne stood in the doorway, her arms crossed. The small river bird held carefully between her thumb and forefinger. "Is this yours?" she asked, her voice flat, an accusation, not a question. I looked up, blinking as if startled. I looked at her, then at Ben, and I gave them the best performance of my life. I let my mouth hang open. I summoned a look of guilty, cornered fear. I confessed. I told them everything, a fiction woven from the threads of their own likely assumptions. I told them I made the percussive noises by knocking a mallet against an old, resonant bucket. I told them I faked the giant footprints with a pair of custom-made stamps I had carved myself from oak. I told them, my voice cracking with feigned emotion, that I had been creating this local legend for years, out of a profound and soul-crushing loneliness. I saw the belief drain from Ben's face, the fire of discovery in his eyes extinguished and replaced by a cold, wet ash of pity and disgust. He would not meet my gaze. Dr. Thorne listened to my entire rambling confession without interruption. When I was finished, a pathetic, manufactured sob catching in my throat, she simply nodded once. She placed the carved bird on my workbench without a word, turned, and walked away. They packed up their camp before noon. Their efficiency in leaving was as unnerving as it had been in their arrival. By evening, the meadow was empty again. The only sign they had ever been there, the crushed patterns in the grass. The silence that returned was profound, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a tomb. I had won. The forest was quiet again, wrapped in a silence so deep it felt like a wound. The secret was safe, buried under the shame of a pathetic old man's hoax, a story that would be told with pitying laughter in online forums for a few weeks before being forgotten entirely. I sat on my porch for a week, from sunrise to sunset, feeling the profound and terrible ache of my victory. I had saved the king from checkmate by burning the entire board. The silence I had preserved felt hollow, a vacuum where the hum of their generator had been. The solitude I had chosen as my shield now felt absolute, a prison of my own making. The bird song seemed tentative, the rustle of leaves in the wind a mournful sigh. I had driven away the invaders, but in doing so, I had severed the last tenuous thread of connection to the world I had sworn to protect. I had made myself a ghost in my own home. One morning, the 8th morning since my confession, nuts, a slick, expensive car, the color of a starless midnight sky, pulled up my driveway. It moved with a silent, electric grace that was more alien Then the expedition's trucks. A man in a tailored suit that probably cost more than my property taxes got out, holding a thin leather briefcase. He was not a researcher or a blogger. His shoes were polished, his smile was manicured, and his eyes held the placid, predatory calm of a shark. He was a lawyer. He introduced himself with a name I immediately forgot and said he represented a real estate consortium, a name that sounded both powerful and faceless. He explained, with that same pleasant, unwavering smile, that my name had come up in a recent data acquisition. It turned out that Ben, in his anger and public humiliation, had done one last thing. He had not simply faded away. To recoup the financial loss of his failed expedition and to get a final, profitable, and vengefully satisfying story out of his crazy old hermit experience, he had sold everything. He sold the exact GPS coordinates of the drone crash. He sold the thermal imaging data, now framed as an explainable anomaly. He sold his detailed environmental logs, his high-resolution photographs of the valley, and a narrative painting me as the sad, deceptive center of it all. He had not sold this package to hunters or to another cryptozoological team. He had sold it to developers, the lawyer explained, his voice smooth and untroubled, that my falsified geological report from 1972, the very foundation of the valley's protected status, had just been officially and irrevocably overturned. Ben's data, combined with their own new, more advanced ground-penetrating surveys, showed the bedrock to be perfectly, immaculately stable. A prime substrate for high-value foundations, the lawyer said, as if admiring a piece of art. The land's long-held protected status, the one built on my original career-ending lie, had been nullified by a county zoning board in a quiet, unpublicized meeting last Tuesday. They had already purchased the entire valley, all 100,000 acres, from the federal government in a sealed bid. My small parcel of land was now an insignificant island in the middle of their new kingdom. He opened his briefcase and handed me a glossy, heavy brochure. The paper was cool and smooth against my calloused skin. The cover was a photograph of my valley at sunset, digitally enhanced to look even more majestic, more pristine. In elegant white script across the image were the words, "Hemlock Ridge Estates, live above the world." I opened it. My hands, which had been so steady when I lied to Dr. Thorne, now trembled. It was filled with architectural renderings of sleek, glass-walled mansions perched on the cliffs of the northern ridge. The very cliffs where the warden had stood sentinel. There were infinity pools that seemed to spill into the sky, their blue water reflecting the ancient trees they would soon cut down. There were computer-generated images of happy, beautiful people drinking wine on cantilever decks, gazing out over a tamed, curated wilderness. They were not selling homes. They were selling a view I had spent my life trying to keep unseen. The first phase of clearing and construction, he said, his smile never faltering, was scheduled to begin in 2 weeks. He mentioned something about a generous offer for my property room, a relocation package. But the words were just a meaningless buzz in my ears. He left. The brochure lay on the small table beside me, its pages open to a 2-page spread of a golf course, winding its way through what was now the warden's denning ground. I stood on my porch, my hand resting on the weathered wood of the railing, and looked out at the forest. My forest, their home. I had spent my entire life as its silent guardian, sacrificing my career, my reputation, my chance at a normal life, all to keep it untouched. I had lied. I had deceived. I had made myself a fool, and I had won. But my victory had only made the prize more visible. In my desperate attempt to hide the secret of its soul, I had inadvertently advertised the beauty of its body. I had not saved it. I had only made it more desirable. And the silence that followed the departure of the lawyer's car was the heaviest one of all. It was the silence of a coming ending.